Hello, my name's Danny and I'm a hero-holic. Oh, I'm sorry, wrong music. Now, obviously, I am sitting on a glittery brown leather, so I feel like I should be a fucking member of ABBA. So this is basically like an experiment for this year. Obviously, the conference is guided by a lot of wonderful discussions that we have after the panels and when we're at the pub and things like that. But we've never really had the opportunity to sort of have a discussion together en masse and sort of get the different perspectives. You've all been looking at very, very distinct areas of superhero discourse and areas of the genre itself. And one thing, before I carry on, I just want to say that I have been so impressed by the quality of the papers today. It's been like probably the single best day that we've had while we've been doing this. It's just they were so informative and intellectually rigorous, funny, and just, it was very, very invigorating. And also, I think, and Eva mentioned this, that, so many of those papers, the way that they link to each other was just very, very effective, and it really does reinforce the strength of what I think the superhero project is and the way that everything goes. But what I really wanted to, I suppose, get the perspectives from everyone here live and also the people that are on Zoom, is to sort of get a sense of the state of the genre. During Dan's paper earlier on, I was really struck by the detail when he spoke about the Marvel roster going through to 2025. And basically, you're looking at a new piece of material like every 4 or 5 weeks. And that's just Marvel. So with DC and other entities, you're looking at a constant stream of material. This is in stark contrast, of course, to when I was young, and that a superhero movie franchise would be either Superman or Batman, and you get them every 3 years, and that would be it. The superhero TV landscape was pretty lightweight at that time. But now we are just suffused with material, and it's actually, possibly quite overwhelming. So I've got like a sort of a general list of areas, but I wanted to sort of open it up to you and to, go beyond the ideas that you've been talking about in your papers and just get a sense of, what you think the state of the genre is now. Because clearly there's been talk over the last few years of superhero fatigue, that perhaps there's just far too much material now. So I'll be up here sort of like guiding it along, and if just put your hand up, say your piece, talk to other people, but I'll be sort of like the guiding fatherly presence, as it were.
We're doomed.
But yes, exactly.
Shouldn't that should be the all-father?
Yes, exactly.
We're double doomed.
It's really just an opportunity for us all to sort of get a sense of what the state of the genre is now in 2022, what are the dominant concerns, how the discourse is going to be informed. And, I suppose I'll open it up. Do we think that there is incoming superhero fatigue? Is the bubble about to burst? I hope it's not, or we're fucked, as far as this is concerned. Rob?
Well, I hadn't thought about this, because I thought, we're at the next golden age, but Dan raised a very interesting point this morning. He was talking about this fragmentation, particularly with WandaVision, where, audiences now could know the whole narrative story or don't need to know the whole narrative story. But we saw that happen with comic books, where there was a time when comic books were doing print runs of hundreds of thousands, and then the stories became so diffuse that it kind of alienated a lot of readers. And it became a thing that specialists and fans started following a storyline, but at the expense of general public being able to go to the shop, buy a single comic book, be pretty sure it's going to be following generic conventions, there's a hero that's going to do a thing, and I don't need to be reading every edition around it to follow a story, I can just dip in. But now we're getting to a point where the dip-inners are in fact being perhaps alienated because the story is so dependent on the paratextual material that we could see a kind of collapse in the same way that comic books themselves ended up ceasing to be a kind of popular entertainment and became a kind of specialist entertainment.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I normally fall on the side of no. But I think, especially in the last 18 months, as we've seen the MCU really kind of push the television stuff. One of my things I think could cause mass fatigue is an over-reliance on interconnectivity. So that in order, if you want to watch the next Avengers movie, you're going to have to know, not only are you going to have to watch all these films that lead up to it, but characters like Kate Bishop, Kamala Khan, everyone else that have only appeared in these shows, you now have to be following along an even greater story. And like you said, whenever there's an event book now, like there's a large-scale comic story, not only do you have to read the main 8, 10, 12 issue saga, but then there's like these 30, 40 tiny stories of what every other character in this period is up to. And as a comic reader, and as an experienced comic reader, and someone that does it regularly, that's exhausting for me. Never mind if you're someone who doesn't have a deep knowledge of the universe or the publishing. That will put general audiences off, and I do think that applying that same level of interconnectivity to the films and the shows, that's a genuine concern that it might alienate readers.
So, yeah, Alex.
I would disagree that there is something bad coming. I think it's going to be amazing, and it's going to be great. This is going to be so totally banal, it's going to be wonderful. The most profitable, or one of the most profitable types of television in the United States is the Law and Order series of shows. And that one has fractalized into Law and Order, SVU, Law and Order, this, that, and the other. And the reason I want to take this example, they're not interconnected, but what they are interconnected with is one is the procedural aspect of it, that you know certain types of things can happen, certain types of things can be expected. So the dip-inners can do that. But what they are connected to is an idea of New York, or an idea of Boston, and an idea of things that have happened in our actual contemporary world, whether they be social themes or political events. The same could happen with the superhero genre in that, yes, there is this massive explosion of TV shows and movies and everything, so it's absolutely impossible to follow it all. The same way, viewers and dip-inners are not watching all of the Law and Order shows, but when you do dip into these things, you say like, well, I generally know that there's this universe of superheroes, and I know that every now and then there will be a wink to something that may or may not connect to everything else. But you can kind of ignore that stuff and still watch the shows. You can still watch a Luke Cage, for instance, without really having to bother with the multiverse of madness. You can still watch the multiverse of madness. And there's going to be some things that do require a little bit more interconnectivity, and that's going to definitely play towards the expert readers and the expert watchers, and that's fine, but there's going to be, through this fragmentation, through this massive expansion, plenty of space for the parts of the Marvel Universe that are a little bit less, deep, or maybe a new, fresh take on the same character or set of characters. That stuff can still happen and creates more space for that, I would say. Yeah, both things can happen at the same time, but I remain optimistic rather than afraid.
So we've got a comment from Zhao. Zhao, after you.
Okay, thank you. You said continuity, then the bad signal going to me. So that's my area of expertise. So I agree with both of you, but it depends on what do you mean by superhero as a genre. So as a genre, as like a Western is a genre, is a collection of tropes and way of doing things. Because superhero is not a genre that can exist by itself. It has to be combined with a narrative genre, so action, comedy, drama, romance, or anything else. Superhero is a collection of tropes. This collection of tropes, I think, is not going anywhere. But the Marvel experiment of doing everything very tightly connected is kind of getting heavy. The weight of its continuity, it's not going to make it fall flat because the comics never disappeared because of that. What happened was the viewership started to dwindle because you need to read more and more and more. So what the antidote to this, what they have doing right now, they are doing more self-contained stuff. You can watch like Hawkeye, what Hawkeye does, what Kate Bishop has or has not done. Maybe she will appear in the next Avengers and they make like a Christmas tree joke about how she destroyed a Christmas tree in Times Square. But that Times Square was in the building, but that's the point. You have to have both ways. What happened was Marvel was building so fast and so vigorously to be this tightly connected Avengers continuity that now it has had time to breathe a little bit. The problem is the hardcore fans are trying to get antsy. Nothing is getting as connected anymore. Nothing is getting as progressive. So the story of the world, what I call the meta plot, is not going forward. So the fans are getting antsy. So the problem is this cycle. They have to do both things at the same time. They have to create material to move the metaphors forward, but they have to do things for the smaller audiences. Because that's the problem. If they want to still be a mainstream powerhouse as they have become, they have to do things to both publics. They have to activate the hardcore fans that eat continuity as they eat cereal every morning, and they have to activate the normal fans with big blockbuster movies. The thing is that Marvel, as a comics company, they know what not to do. They know they cannot do what the comics did, which is basically a cycle of spin-offs and crossovers and big events and everything else. So that's why I think they are doing this big lull. The phases 4 and 5 will probably not get a big Avengers movie until the end of phase 5, probably. So they are doing a lot of away time, so everyone can recharge and we can have this time where not everyone is feeling like we have superhero overdrive. We can relax a little bit. But while they're doing that, they need to activate the fans, their super fans. And this is where they're faltering. And this balancing act, I think, is very difficult.
Thank you, Jao. I suppose one of the key questions I have of the superhero genre now is whether the perception of the superhero is being altered over time. I spoke in my paper about film being the biggest delivery avenue of this genre, and you have basically got many of these characters who are now just basically action heroes fitting into that paradigm rather than being a superhero. I mentioned about how you've got that mission powers identity paradigm, and actually the onus is on the powers and the spectacle that is created by that. Do we think that the superhero is actually becoming fundamentally altered as a result of the prominence of the screen iterations? Yes?
Altered in a sense, yes, but not altered in a sense of not being a recognisable superhero, but more a matter of, it's like the action hero is kind of being pushed out. So I would say that if you have if we look at the Hollywood landscape, the big money makers are all franchises. If it's not Marvel or DC, it's Jurassic, or it's Fast and Furious, or it's Transformers. And what these are, that it is, I think to a large extent, we've seen the rise of the franchise of the IP being the dominant players over the past 2 decades now. And what that said is that the standalone, the action hero who is just an action hero seems a lot reduced. And if you get that, then typically it's going to be tied to, I think, what we may have previously identified as an action movie has perhaps been pushed aside and incorporated into other areas, into other sort of subgenres. So you'll have the superhero, you'll have the other, let's say, the super spy, whether it's James Bond or Ethan Hunt, or whether it's the muscle car of Fast and Furious. Or you get the odd exceptions very odd exceptions of something that's more kind of got a different branding to it, such as a Christopher Nolan project, in that regard. Or, another franchise would be the Monsterverse. So it almost feels as though it's not so much that the superhero has become a more generic action hero, but that the generic action hero has had to find other spaces.
But isn't it the fact that, with you in a second, Mark, that as I noted, the DC superheroes are killing on film. There's a lot of, within the MCU, there's a lot of killing that's done peripherally by those characters. And so therefore, because of that, and because of that desire to sort of drag the superhero into the adult sphere, just as a process of that, they're moving away from what they were fundamentally designed to be.
Except, haven't they killed in comic books anyway? It might be rare, but it has happened.
But I think it's kind of more habitual now. I'm saying with the Snyderverse movies, it just seems to be there. It's not, it's just normal part of the landscape, which I thought was quite strange. Mark?
Yeah, I was just saying, I think the big thing is, I think superheroes are changing for purely practical reasons. They don't have anything to do with necessarily the narrative or the stories or what the characters do. It's the fact that the main delivery point is TV and film. And in TV and film, superheroes are played by human beings who are mortal and who have agents. And so, whereas Spider-Man can stay the same in the comics for 60 odd years, Tom Holland is going to get older, and Tom Holland is going to ask for more money. And that's why in the Avengers, Robert Downey Jr. is not doing it anymore. So we can't have Iron Man. And that does not happen in comics. Comics, I'm going to mention a bit about as he said, one of the few things he said that was correct. They do revert the status quo, even if it takes a few issues. We can always come back and we can always get Peter Parker back. When Tom Holland asks for too much money, or when Tom Holland gets too old to do it properly, we can't have that Spider-Man. And I think that's a really important reason why the Marvel Universe is moving into all these Moon Knights and all these characters we never thought would be seen on television. Because they've got to. Because we can't have Chris Evans Captain America anymore, unless it comes back in some way. But I think it's that practical reason that superheroes are no longer, there must be change. There must be development because the actual human beings themselves will change. I think that's a massive thing. That's really exciting about how the Marvel Universe works now. Is that now when we say Tony Stark is dead, it's not like Tony Stark dying in the comics. He probably is dead, and he probably won't be coming back, just because of the practical reasons of the actor.
But there's
We have Carl with his hand up, but first, Teresa made a good point, saying, I think the television series has made a difference to characterization across a number of franchises, to which Jao responds, they have more space to have deeper characterization.
Okay, and Carl, you want to say something?
You're muted, Carl.
Yeah, I just realised. Thanks. Thanks, guys. It's really just to riff off what Vince was saying and what Teresa sort of followed that with. As I say, from a video game point of view, initially one of the things that sort of got me into looking at Fortnite, which I seem to always be harping on about, which upsets me in all manner of ways, is that I think there was a quote, an article in Kotaku where they said the headline was something like, I killed Superman with a shotgun and it didn't feel right. It's the idea that when you start to take these brands and start to bleed them into these larger properties, in the case of Fortnite, arguably bigger than any other video game superhero brand out there, these mutations start to occur, and obviously with volume of people that are playing these games, we're talking tens of millions of people, same with Multiverses that's just come out, tens of millions of people, and of all ages. And while we might not be seeing it at the moment, it could be that in 5-10 years, the people that are playing these games are the ones that have their expectations of where, what superheroes are about and what they should be doing. They might not watch the TV shows because they might not be old enough, or they might not have subscription to Disney Plus. They might not be old enough to go see the films, but they're certainly playing these games. And that's something that I don't think we'll know quite yet, or I've not seen studies on quite yet, but it's potentially something that we'll see in the near future, is the impact of, these games are essentially played by children. So we're not talking about the injustice ones where, like Danny said, Superman punches the Joker and whatnot. But sorry, actually Vincent's got something to say, so obviously, cool.
unless there's anyone else first.
Eva.
Thank you. I think that we're asking the wrong question. I think the question is, or a better question might be, what do superheroes mean? And superheroes have meant different things at different points. They had different audiences. The audiences had different ways of interacting with them. And I think the question we're asking is, what aspect of our society or our lives or our technology do superheroes represent now, and how will that change in the next, I don't know, 50 years? Longer than I will be monitoring it, but yeah.
Vincent, you want to follow that up, and then James?
Yeah, this was sort of following up what the last two people and what you've said, Eva, relates to. Because the other thing we have to consider, of course, is, who are the audiences? Because as was mentioned, the actors age and get too expensive, and we move on from them. But are audiences going to continue? Because there are those of us who, many of us probably remember when the MCU, using that as an example, started, and we have followed it, and there will be other fans who have also followed it since then. Whether it works as dip in, dip out for, say, maybe the audiences that you referred to, Carl, who were playing the games, younger generations, children right now, born in the last decade, will they be consuming these as well? And if there's a point of saturation, then it may rely, I guess it comes to the question, how much is going to rely on the previous cultural knowledge? On the other hand, maybe it doesn't rely upon that because superhero entertainment, superhero movies, it's a part of popular culture. It's that ubiquitous that there would be an expectation. Your kid's 5. Do they want to have an Iron Man thing or a Shang-Chi thing, for instance? And it's a question of what will continued new audiences be engaging with.
James?
I think just to agree with and build on what Eva was saying, and because absolutely what everyone's saying is the case. Films and TV are changing superheroes, and there's these factors we need to take into consideration. But they're not the only thing that's changing superheroes. We need to look at how culture has changed, how cultural discourse has changed, how the structure of feelings that we live in has changed. Superheroes have been around since 1938, and there have been so many shifts in culture that have changed. Superheroes change what we consider a hero to be, and we need to be attentive to all of that. And as we've seen over the past few days, so many papers have been considering that, have been exploring how superhero texts respond to, engage with, or in dialogue with the times. And I think in that spirit as well, we shouldn't try and think of kind of a definition of superhero in a too limiting way, because even in like the first few years of their creation, you had these superheroes created that represented quite different things and drew on different things, and the kind of popular texts they were drawing from had all kinds of qualities. They were drawing on technological things, magic, sorcery, horror. So they have their roots in all these different things. They're hybrid figures anyway, so they've always had that capacity for great variation and fluctuation, and I think we're just seeing that happening in new ways now.
Alex?
Danny, you mentioned the mission power identity thing, and I do want to underscore that there are changes culturally and socially, also in how we engage with these different media. And the mission power identity is something that really can be brought over better through television than through cinema. And cinema is the place where you have the economic needs to have it be a blockbuster, to make a lot of money and all of that, but because of its format, you have a limited number of minutes that you can get someone's butt in a cinema seat. You cannot sit them down there every day for a week so that they can binge watch a show in a movie. So the interconnectivity that is necessary in the MCU through these big movie projects is something that is actually going to be the part where the squeaky wheel starts to show up. But you have these other mediums, the games, the TV shows, and the way we watch TV is no longer waiting until Wednesday at 7 o'clock when the thing comes on. We watch them on our own terms, individually, at home, on a big screen, small screen, rectangle phone screen, whatever. The same way younger people are interacting with games and other sorts of things that they're creating in internet fandom and all of that. So heroes and their missions, their powers and their identities are still things that all levels of culture and all levels of these developing social niches they continue to interact with, and they continue to want, and they continue to mean something to them. And as long as this sort of transversal publication of stuff and these stories of superheroes still go out there through all these different methods, it's still going to be relevant. Not the same 1930s Superman, but there will be a sense of Superman, and it's not going to be a two-dimensional killing machine just like every other like muscle-bound action hero that now wears a cape. These things are going to be explored in these fragmented little ways, and it's going to have more meaning. It's going to still be present. It's going to get bigger, more diffuse.
Dan?
Yeah, I was just going to say that for me, I think saturation as well can be in and of itself a crucible, like a filtration point.
Yeah.
I suppose the interesting thing up to debate is whether it's going to be a pleasant crucible or a not pleasant crucible, because you need to get through the period of time where, as Eva said, what a superhero is and what it means for society over the years, you need to get to that point first. And I think we are entering a stage of great flux. And I think it's more the case of maybe not necessarily taking a positive or negative position on it. I think it's about being mindful of how it's being done and essentially where you can assess that critically, because it's not just the creatives and the storytellers or the academics involved in this. There are other parties, and essentially where it comes out could be the winner of those groups would dictate where we end up, say 20, 25 years from now. But certainly for me, oversaturation, I mean, if it all goes down the pan and like everyone stops watching Marvel films, well, they're going to have to do something drastic to remedy that, or they won't exist anymore. So,
okay, so a good leading on point from that is, what are the comics? We're at a point now where, 20, 30 years ago, you could have, a book like Spawn could sell 5 million copies of one single issue, right? The Death of Superman in 1992. Now the average sales for comics is roughly about 20 or 30,000 copies.
I'd like to point out that while Spawn sold 5 million, it didn't necessarily ship 5 million.
Okay, there's the image salesperson there. But yeah, you're seeing massive changes in terms of sales, and there's always been that accusation that the comics companies like DC and Marvel are IP farms. They're creating stuff that basically goes to studios. So are we going to basically see the demise of the signature medium? Rob?
This is purely anecdotal, and I know people will have issues with this. I'm not a comic book person,
okay.
And I can promise you I have never in any given year spent more than $3.50 on a comic book. Meaning I might have bought one comic book in a year type of thing. I just subscribed to the Marvel Unlimited, and I'm reading them in a format that I don't fully agree with, but there is no question I will renew the subscription every year. And so the idea of me as a not-comic person spending $70 a year on a thing that I don't spend money on, I think is a good sign of the future. Now, is it a comic book? One of the things that made me quite sad was looking at Bruno's presentation and seeing these physical things, which I don't know if it's just his own personal collection that he's taken pictures of. They don't look like what I see on my tablet at all. This is glossy, it's shiny, and it is not a comic book. It's something else. It's a kind of set of still images that move together to tell an animated story. But, provided we get rid of our prejudices about technological content delivery, I think there's a healthy future for both DC and Marvel in terms of alternative media form.
Vicky?
Just sort of linking what Rob said to what Alex said, you were on about how you build that mission power identity through television series, but then wouldn't it just make sense to carry on reading the comics, because that gives you an infinite long amount of time with them?
Comics aren't going anywhere.
Exactly.
You can also read those.
And they cost a lot less for a company to make, so wouldn't it be better for them to start promoting the comics more?
Oh,
I'll make a really good point that we were talking yesterday on the way here about some of the stuff we're reading. One of my big gripes I've had with Marvel and DC over the last few years is that I think they should be doing more with the movies to encourage people to go and read comics. Because I think pretty much since the 90s, comics have moved themselves only to be being sold in comic shops, which are very alienating to people that don't regularly read comics. I remember when I first started to get back into reading comics after quite a few years away, it was quite a daunting experience going into a physical comic shop and being surrounded by people that, you know, there's a lot of elitism in that kind of fan base. So it can be very hard for a lot of people to really get into it, really sink their teeth into it, because they're not used to the environment. And digital comics are a really good way of doing that. They're affordable, you know, for like what, £7, £8 a month, you can read as much as you want. Something I've always said for years is that if you buy a movie ticket to go and see Black Panther, why don't you get a digital code to read a specific run of Black Panther? Say it's a run that the movie kind of took inspiration from. You go and watch Black Panther, you get a QR code to go and read the Ta-Nehisi Coates first volume, or something like that.
Didn't they do that with Moon Knight, where there's a QR code in the back of the first episode where you can read one of his first appearances?
Because I think if people, whatever kind of form of media it comes in, if people become enamoured with a character, they're going to want to consume more media of that character. So in the example of Moon Knight, if you've watched the show and you want more Moon Knight, they should be making it more accessible for you to get more Moon Knight.
yeah, I mean, I can remember, you know, in the sort of early 90s when you could go into your average newsagent and they would just have racks of comics. And one of the things I discovered 3 years ago is that I went to Sao Paulo in Brazil for the first time, and there was a sort of newsagent kiosk on the corner of a street, and it was absolutely stuffed with comics. And the culture there is just, you know, it's just, they're everywhere. And that was quite striking to see. But I think, you know, it would be very sad if that medium went. I mean, I don't know if it is, but clearly the sales are just depleting more and more. James?
Yeah, building on that, and this problem of elitism, it's, a key part of that is cost. And, you know, this is issues of finance, issues of class. Because I read comics in some form of my life. It was like, you know, dandy when I was a kid. And I always wanted to read American comics, but I didn't have the money until I started actually having kind of a paid job and disposable income, and I could actually start buying them. But they're so expensive. You know, it's like what, $4 or $5, which equates to like, you know, 4 or 5 quid now for a single issue. If you want to buy multiple comics, then that's a big investment every week. A lot of people cannot afford that. But it's also, while I much prefer physical over digital, as Robert was saying, I think it's where digital can potentially save comics to make it much cheaper, much more accessible for people. And also with, you know, comic shops, sadly a lot of them closing down, digital does make them much more widely accessible and in places that didn't have comic book shops before. So I think digital can potentially save the medium in that way.
But there's another thing I noted here is that, you know, 2026 is going to be quite a big year because it's going to be 40 years of grim and gritty. Yeah, no. You know, with Dark Knight Returns, and we are still mired in that. And certainly, if you look at the DC movies, for example, they feel that the template for all of their superhero properties is that very grim, violent aspect. You know, they did it with Man of Steel, making it look like it was Batman Begins. And then, you know, I think that alienates children, who have always been traditionally the core audience for this. But, you know, there's such a industrial dependency on that by Hollywood You know, you notice that Joker basically was, you know, just a mix of like the King of Comedy and Taxi Driver. The Batman was the Dark Knight times Zodiac and Seven. You know, and you know, I really enjoyed the Batman, the Joker less so. But you know, it's there's this chronic addictive dependency on this, and I think the more, and you know, 40 years we've nearly been dealing with this.
There is perhaps the counter programming, because for the children, audience, there are seem to be specific texts aimed at them. There was DC Teen Titans, which just had DC League of Super Pets going on cinema release. It's almost as if there's a recognition of aim something at different markets, and you even get a slight variation of that in the Disney Plus series. Like you've got, if you want. No, it's almost like with this I Am Groot series. Is this Marvel's answer to Peppa Pig? But so it's a matter of, well, yeah, we can get them at all ages, as it were. And why not?
Did Carl say something?
According to Carl, Owen said it just exactly what he wanted, but better.
Carl, can I get that in writing, please?
It's written. It's written right in front of me.
Screenshot that and print it off for me.
Absolutely not.
I'm doing it.
So I suppose then is superheroes like literally going to be an exclusively screen medium in the coming years?
I mean, it could be a screen medium because one, purely, in a way I would argue, because part of the reason why superheroes are so attractive for Hollywood studios is Hollywood has become like a franchise machine. DC and Marvel offer them this huge back catalogue of stories to adapt. But if you know, and there's like, you know, decades worth of stories there. But if they did stop publishing comics, if they did stop writing them, eventually they'd run out of stories to adapt. So yeah.
And yeah, as well as being a feeder plot essentially to the movies, it's a backstop, right? So if the movies start to tank, then maybe they start investing more in the comic books and trying to reinvigorate that audience. I think that's the interesting part, isn't it? It's almost like a very thin lifeline, almost. If the gargantuan enterprise of movies starts to dwindle, well, we've got a whole other avenue that we can try and reinvigorate.
Yeah, I mean, you know, with something like Batman being, you know, a very, very prized corporate product, I mean, there's no way they're going to let that go fallow. It's simply too profitable. But, you know, it's very, I think we're going through a time that we're going to see a lot of change. I mean, the final point, I suppose, is that, you know, I noticed that, you know, given the world that we live in, where we have such a fractious discourse, culturally informed by politics, where everyone's kind of like a good guy or a bad guy, you know, it struck me that maybe one of the reasons for sort of superheroes' popularity is it does present that kind of black and white moral worldview that is, you know, oddly comforting when obviously the world is every conceivable shade of grey. And, you know, the fact that we've seen in like the last 5 or 10 years such a boost of that, and that kind of rather oppressive cultural discourse that we have in that way might be a strange reason for that sort of boost in popularity. Alex, you want to say something final?
Yeah, the question of do you think it's going to become exclusively screen medium?
Mm-hmm.
There is a little bit, and I'm not accusing you of snootiness, but in that question, when that type of question is asked, it is somewhat snooty. It comes from the assumption of like, well, wouldn't it be something, are we then missing something if it's only on screen? And I would say that that question isn't necessarily super important to ask, because that's a function of how societies, specifically Western and more developed societies, consume culture now. When we looked at the 1930s and 40s with the cheap price of paper and the ability to distribute these things in paperbacks or in comic books and put them on newsstands, that was a way to get a whole bunch of these stories in front of people's eyeballs. Now the way is on your cell phone, in a gaming console, or downloading a gaming console. It's going to be on your Netflix accounts or wherever the hell else you're watching. That is now how we consume stuff. And if over the next 10, 15, 20 years, we shift to consuming stuff in a different way, God forbid, in the metaverse, then things will be consumed differently. And yeah, there will be an element of writing the characters, because that's core to superheroes. They're written as comics, and we will still call something comics, whether it's written for exclusive digital publication, or whether somebody somewhere in a basement somewhere is still printing physical pieces of paper just to like nominally check that off. Doesn't really matter. We will still have superheroes. What they mean might be different, how we consume them might be different, but it's still going to be there, and that's going to change.